Well, I was thinking, every year I think it's the Oxford Dictionary, right, comes up with the word or the phrase of the year, right? And I'm thinking if they don't make social distancing, the word of the year, honestly, here's how it went through my brain, because my brain sometimes goes pessimistic sometimes, right? So if they don't make social distancing the phrase, the word of, or the phrase of the year, I'm sort of afraid of what the rest of the year is going to bring that is going to overshadow social distancing. That's how it went through my head. Because based on what we've lived through so far, 3.5 months of 2020, social distancing is this thing. In fact, I was typing social distancing into my notes just so that I could remember to mention it this morning, and the autocorrect didn't know what to do with it. It's like distancing is not a word. It's not supposed to be used that way, and yet we hear that every day, every newscast, people are talking about it, and it is like the thing. And as I was thinking about that, I thought about Good Friday, and I thought about Easter Sunday, and the Saturday in between. And we did our Good Friday service online, of course, Friday. And I mentioned the fact that there was basically a social distancing. There was a time on Saturday in the year 33. Jesus had died on Friday, and because of the way the Jewish faith works, from sundown, about 6 o'clock in the evening, until 6 o'clock the following evening is how they measure their day, 24 hours, but it starts 6 o'clock p.m. So from 6 o'clock Friday night until 6 o'clock Saturday night, those who were practicing the Jewish faith, especially those there in Jerusalem, the closest followers, the friends of Jesus, the ones who had been with him, they had invested their time into his ministry, they'd invested their money into his ministry, they believed in him, they believed that he was who he claimed to be. And then they saw him die. A brutal death that was saved really only for the worst criminals in the Roman Empire. And as it got near sundown, he died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they only had 3 hours to get him down off the cross, try to clean him up a little bit. They didn't have time to do a full burial preparation. No matter how many times he told them, this is what's going to happen, I don't know if they just didn't understand it. I don't know if they didn't believe him. Probably a little bit of both. And so when it happened, when he died, they were shocked. He was arrested, he was tried, and he was crucified. And they were shocked. It was not anywhere in their perspective that this was going to happen. They had not made funeral plans, funeral arrangements. They borrowed a cave just so that they had a place to lay him down. And they didn't have the spices where they could make him, clean him up and make him smell a little bit better or anything. All they could do was take him down off the cross, maybe wipe up a little bit, wrap him up as much as they could, lay him on the slab in this cave that they had borrowed, roll this stone across the entrance, the mouth of the opening of the cave, and rush home so that they could be in their homes, locked in, hands washed, sanitized, all the stuff that we're doing right now, before 6 o'clock Friday evening, so that they could start their 24 hours of Sabbath, so that they could start this, what was supposed to be a week-long celebration, dating all the way back to almost 1500 BC, when God rescued the nation of Israel out of Egypt. And they thought that Jesus was supposed to be the deliverer. They thought that he was supposed to be the one that was going to rescue them again from the Roman Empire, that he was going to start his kingdom, and everything was going to be just like the prophets for centuries had prophesied. And they were locked at home, and he was locked in a cave, dead. That was not how they expected to spend Passover that year. And I think the things that we are feeling, the things that we are going through during these stay-at-home orders, during these lockdowns, people losing their jobs, the time and the money that we've invested into things, into corporations, the hope that we had put in people around us, maybe even in the government, our government officials, people we had elected. We said, we want you to do these things for us. There are a lot of people, as I watch through social media, as I talk to people, not so much in person right now, but as we communicate with each other, there are a lot of people right now, today, who have no hope. They don't know where life is going. Everything that they thought that they had figured out, the good job, the reputation, everything that they thought was on track, disappeared literally in a matter of days. For some, it was even quicker than that. For some, it's hung on a little bit longer. There are people who are considered essential versus non-essential right now, which is a weird way to think of things, especially in an era where we try to value everybody, to call some people essential and some people non-essential. We know we're not talking about value and worth, and yet it's weird to say it that way, isn't it? Especially for those who are home right now because you're considered non-essential. You're not essential to our nation right now. You don't help move things forward right now. Yes, you have an important job. Yes, as a person, you're important, but you are not essential to us. That can do a lot to a person's psyche, to their mental state. Say, do I have a purpose? Am I doing enough? Should I be doing something different? If this happens again, how do I become an essential person? And there are a lot of people, maybe not you, maybe you've come to grips with this, maybe you've got a different worldview that doesn't cause you to think that way, but there are a lot of people right now that think, what am I doing here anyway? Do I have purpose? Do I have a meaning? Everything that I thought was going well is now completely off the rails. And if there is a God out there, why in the world does he let stuff like this happen? Why in the world? How could he be involved in something like this? Doesn't this prove maybe that there is no God? Doesn't this prove that we are all on our own, that this is not, these people that say that there's a God and he loves us and all of these things? How can that be true based on the experience that we are having right now? I guarantee you, that 2,000 years ago, the people who were locked in their homes, who had stood in front of the cross, felt the exact same way. How could God let this happen? I thought he was supposed to be our Savior. I thought he was supposed to be our deliverer. I thought he was the one. How could God let this happen? Is God really listening? Is he really here for us? I thought we were on track. That's the attitude that people were in on that day that we now call Easter Sunday. You see, for those of us who believe in Jesus as our Savior, and we're gathered here online and in various churches, and we're here to celebrate what happened on Sunday was that Jesus came back to life. They didn't know that on Saturday. All they knew is that he was dead. They had no hope. We have the benefit of hindsight. And the reason that we celebrate, like I said on Friday during our Good Friday service, the reason that we call Good Friday good is not because Friday was good, it's because Sunday was good. Sunday made Good Friday good. Easter made Good Friday. If it weren't for Sunday, if it weren't for the fact that Jesus came back to life, Friday was just another dark day in history. Yeah, Jesus died, but what does that mean? Okay? Sunday is what makes that good, because Jesus came back to life. Jesus is alive. We do not worship just a dead religious leader. Every other religion in the world looks back at a religious leader and says, weren't they so good? A Christian who understands what the Bible teaches about who Jesus is and what he did and what his claims were, we don't say he was such a good person. We say he is a good person. He is our God. He is the one whom we worship, and he is still ministering right now on our behalf, and he is coming back. That's what makes this weekend so good. That's what Easter is about. But I'd like to focus within that purview, within that perspective, I'd like to focus on Jesus' last word and last action, because that's what takes us from Friday into Sunday. Jesus' last word and last action. If you grew up in a religious setting or in church or something, you may have heard of the famous 7 sayings of the cross, right? The Jesus' final words. And as we look through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels of the New Testament, we see that Jesus, each one records that, Jesus said something here, and we get the full picture when we bring these 4 accounts together. I'd like to look at his very, very last word and his very last action, because I think these two things together, for those who are paying attention, set up what we're celebrating today. And so I'd like to go to the Gospel of John, chapter 19. And our main passage, we'll look at a couple of other verses today as well, but our main passage this morning is John chapter 19, verses 28 through 30, because it contains Jesus' last word and his last action. Let me just read these 3 verses, and then I'll point out a few things here. John chapter 19, verses 28, 29, and 30. After this, Jesus is on the cross. He's said everything else. He's been beaten and everything else, and he's been on the cross now for 6 hours. After this, Jesus, realizing by this time everything was completed, said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I'm thirsty. So a jar full of sour wine was there, and so they put a sponge soaked in sour wine on a hyssop branch, a reed, and they lifted it up to his mouth. Don't forget, he was hanging up on the cross. They were on the ground, so they had to basically put a sponge on a stick, and held it up to him just so that he could try to wet his lips a little bit. Verse 30, when he had received the sour wine, Jesus said, it is completed. Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. In English, just because of the way languages translate from one to another, in English we see that Jesus' last word was really 3 words, right? In verse 30 there, Jesus said, it is completed, or it is finished. But Jesus wasn't speaking English at that time. The Gospel of John wasn't written in English. And Jesus was speaking either Aramaic or Hebrew at the time, and the Gospel of John was written in Greek. And what's interesting with both of those languages, or all 3 of those languages, is that you can put a subject and a verb together into one word. And so the subject of it is completed is it. So it doesn't need a separate word. You can just sort of cram it all together. What John wrote down was actually one word that unpacks in English into 3. And the word that John wrote was tetelestai. It has been finished. It has been. It uses a particular tense of the verb, and I know that most people don't care about this stuff, but it is significant theologically. He used a very particular tense of the verb to say something is now done and the results are lasting. Not just something is done in the past. If I say, I ate yesterday, the results of that are not lasting to today because I'm hungry again, right? Okay, you say, well, the results are lasting. Okay, well, physically, yes, I grew, that sort of thing. But as far as the results of eating, the purpose of eating is not to, get fat. The purpose of eating is to nourish oneself, to be healthy, stamina and all those things. If I use just a simple past tense and say I ate, the results lasted for a while, but they're not lasting again because I need to eat again. And we use that with most of our verbs. But a perfect tense, this tense that has this aspect of completeness and perfectiveness, says something happened in the past and the results didn't end. They're still in effect. They're still being felt, at least by the point of the speaker or the writer. And theologically, we see these results are still in effect for us today. Jesus didn't just say, it's done. He said, I have done this. This thing that I was sent to do has been completed, and it is still completed. It's never going to have to be done again. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? Okay? And we can see that wasn't true just with Jesus hanging on the cross. Every writer throughout the New Testament, every year that went by, every decade, and now throughout church history, we say the effects of that are still being felt today, 2,000 years later. It is perfect. It is complete. It is finished. And that made me, as I'm thinking about this, think, what's finished? What was finished? Well, there are several things that were finished. When Jesus said, it's completed, it's finished. And by the way, let me say this. I got off on the Greek there for just a second. In Hebrew, the word is kula. Now, if you think about Jesus, he's just about ready to die. He's not up there shouting and preaching. He doesn't have a megaphone. He has very little breath. He can barely get a word out. And so sometimes you'll hear in messages or on you're watching, maybe movies or whatever, and you have Jesus there on the cross, and he's like, "It is finished." I don't think that's the way it went. He didn't have enough breath for that. As he's hanging there, literally with just a breath or two left, and I think it's easier you can see this easier in Hebrew. Because the word is almost a sigh as he's there trying to grab one last breath before he dies. He says, Kula. You can almost hear the breath leaving him as he says it, right? Kula. It's done. It's done. It stands finished. It's done. So what did he do? What did he do? Well, his temptations and his sinless life were finished. Jesus came to the planet. He was born just like you and me, except that he was God wrapped up in a human body. He had a human nature. He had a human will. He did not have a sin nature because he's God. And yet he faced, according to the book of Hebrews, every temptation that you and I face. Everything that we could possibly face. You say, well, he didn't have video and he didn't have any of that stuff as far as the exact things, but you don't think that he was tempted throughout the course of his life with greed and envy, wanting something that he shouldn't have that somebody else has? You don't think that he was tempted as a teenage boy with lust as a teenager? You don't think he was tempted with anger as he had little brothers and sisters coming up behind him? How would you like to be Jesus' little brother or sister? Did Mary or Joseph ever say to the little ones, why can't you just be more like Jesus? We've been saying that. Everybody says that now. Why can't we be more like Jesus? It was probably really annoying for the little kids, the little brothers and sisters growing up. Jesus apparently always did everything right. And yet, throughout the course of his life, he had to suffer all of these attacks on him because of who he was. And in fact, his temptations were harder than anyone that you and I will ever face, simply because of the fact that we give in. The temptation, the longer you hold out, the temptation gets stronger, right? It gets stronger and stronger and stronger. At some point, we give in. Temptation stops. He never gave in. His temptations went beyond any temptation that you've ever had and that I've ever had, simply because he didn't give in. The struggle between his human will and his divine will never had to happen again. It was completed. It was over. It was finished. We call it his kenosis, the fact that he emptied himself of the rights that he had as God. When he came to earth, when he was born, when God comes to earth, he should be able to step on the planet and say, I'm God, bow down now. Right? And one day, the book of the Revelation tells us he will do that. I am God, you will bow before me. Philippians chapter 2 says, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Every knee will bow one day. Some will do it out of love and gratitude, and some will do it simply because they're forced to. But everyone will bow their knee before Jesus one day. And he could have come and done it. He didn't. He voluntarily laid aside all of those things that we associate with deity. And Paul uses the term, he emptied himself of those things. Not that he didn't have them anymore, but he laid them aside and said, I am willing to be hungry. I am willing to be thirsty. We just read that in John 19. I am willing to be tempted. God can't be tempted with sin. Jesus said, I'm willing to go through that. I'm willing to be abused. I'm willing to suffer. I'm willing to go through everything fully as a human so that I can be the substitute for all humanity. That was over. It's completed. It's done. His mission was completed. In John chapter 17, Jesus says, I have glorified you, as he's talking to God the Father, I've glorified you on this earth by completing the work that you gave me to do. It was over. It was completed. It was done. And of course, most of all, his sacrifice. His final act, that we'll see in just a second, his final act fulfilled his final word. He had successfully become the voluntary substitute, the voluntary substitutionary sacrifice for the sin of all humanity. It was completed. It was finished. Sin was paid in full. Not because God didn't do enough, not because Jesus didn't do enough. The only reason somebody would die today and go to eternity separated from God, an eternity in hell. And we do believe in a literal hell. We don't like it. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to teach about it, but we do believe that it's true because God said it's true. The only reason that a person would go there is because they've chosen to say, I will try to pay for my own sin. I will try to pay for my own violations against God. Even though Jesus said, it's done, it's paid for. Just let me pay the bill. Let me take care of it. The only reason somebody would go to hell today is because they say, no, thank you. I'll do it myself. And we can't. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, the writer reflects back on the old animal sacrifices, the sacrificial system that Israel used to have. And he connected that to Jesus. And in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 4 through 10, this is what we read. The blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. So when he came into the world, talking about Jesus, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. Jesus took on a human body so that he could die. God can't die. He took on a human body. God gave him a body so that he could be the sacrifice because none of the other sacrifices in the past were good enough. They set up what Jesus was about to do. Whole burnt offerings, verse 6, and sin offerings you took no delight in, and then I said, here I am. I've come. It is written of me in the scroll of the book. I've come to do your will, O God. And the writer of Hebrews then adds this comment in verses 8 through 10, sort of a commentary on what was said there. When he says above, sacrifices and offerings, and whole burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor did you take delight in them, which are offered according to the law. And then he says, here I am, I've come to do your will. He does away with the first so that he can establish the second. By his will, we have been made holy through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. That's the only thing that works. It's the only terms and conditions that God accepts. If we want to be made right with God, if we want to come into a right relationship with God, we have to do it on His terms. I've used the illustration many times in the past, and maybe this is the first time you've heard it or thought about it this way, but it's like those terms and conditions that pop up when you install an app or when you install software on your computer. It's the ones that we don't read, right? Because it says scroll, 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 scroll. And some companies have actually gotten a little tricky about this, haven't they? It used to be when you say, click install, it pops up the terms and conditions, accept, don't accept, and you just click accept. Now some of them have caught on with that, and they say, no, you have to scroll to the bottom before you can click accept, as if that's going to force us to read everything as we're scrolling. What do? We scroll to the bottom, and then we click accept. We have no idea what's inside. They could be packaging all sorts of stuff inside that we're accepting. And yet, if we do not accept the terms and conditions, the company says, sorry, you can't use our software. So what do? Accept, 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 accept. This is the same thing. God says, you want to have a right relationship with me? You want to come to me? You want to be declared not guilty? You want to have a life of meaning? You want to have a life of purpose? You want to have a real life for eternity? Here's my terms and conditions. And yet, spiritually, we collectively and as individuals far too often say, nope, do not accept. I will figure out another way to do it. As if we're all spiritual hackers that are just going to program our own way to do what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Don't accept those terms and conditions. We'll accept every other terms and conditions that are presented to us, but nope. God says Jesus alone, His death, His resurrection alone. Nope, not interested in that. I'll find another way. The whole Bible says it doesn't work that way. You can't do that. Back in John chapter 19, verse 30, that was His last word. It is finished. It is done. It is completed. Everything that you've given me to do is now done. Hula. And then, verse 30, when He had received the sour wine, Jesus said, Kula, it is finished. It is completed. Then He bowed His head, and here's His final action. He gave up His Spirit. His final action was that He gave up His Spirit. Now, it's very important that we understand why this says that He gave up His Spirit. The Bible will never say that Jesus was killed. The Bible will never say that anyone took His life from Him. Okay? Yes, He died. We see that all over the place. He died, but maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement. There may be passages where it says somebody killed Jesus. But the big context is not that Jesus was killed. Nobody killed Jesus. Nobody took His life. Jesus gave His life. And I think that's an important distinction. In fact, this same word that's translated gave up His Spirit shows up a lot of times in John. And I'd just like to do a quick survey through the book of John very quickly and see these words. Starting in there's one verse in chapter 13, and then we'll see a few in chapters 18 and 19. Okay? John chapter 13, look at verse 21. John 13, verse 21. When He had said these things, Jesus was greatly distressed in spirit, and He testified, I tell you the solemn truth, one of you will, here's our word, here's the same word translated gave up in 1930, one of you will betray me. Betray me. Now, go over to chapter 18. We'll see a few of them, and then we'll look at chapter 19 leading up to our verse. And there's a point behind this, trust me, okay? Chapter 18, verse 2. Now Judas, the one who betrayed Him, there's our word. He knew the place because Jesus had met there many times with His disciples. Jump down to verse 5. They replied, He had asked, who are you looking for? They replied, Jesus the Nazarene. He told them, I am He. Now Judas, the one who betrayed Him, was standing there with them. Look at verse 30. Still in chapter 18, verse 30. They replied, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over." There's our word. Handed him over to you. Verse 35. Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own people and your own chief priests have handed you over to me." Verse 36, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over." You see this concept. The first couple of times it's translated betray, and now it's being translated handed over. Look in chapter 19, verse 11. Verse 11. Jesus replied, still talking to Pilate, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over is guilty of greater sin." Verse 16. Then Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And finally, verse 30. When he had received the sour wine, Jesus said, "It is completed." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Isn't that interesting how it's the exact same word and it's translated betrayed, betrayed, and then most of these passages hand over, handed over, handed over, handed over, handed over, until we get to verse 30 and it says, gave up. He gave up his spirit. I think it's significant that John chose this word to say what Jesus' last action was. I don't see something that was taken from him. I don't see something where they killed him. I see just like, well, let me back up for just a second. I think betray is a really good word for this, isn't it? Because to betray takes intention, it takes a willingness, it takes maybe even some thinking through, some planning, and we see this in Judas where he planned this for a while. He gave them the information to where they could find Jesus, and he literally betrayed. He handed them over to he handed Jesus over to them, and it was a bad thing in that case. And then Judas handed Jesus over to the religious leaders, and the religious leaders handed Jesus over to the political leader, Pilate. And then Pilate handed Jesus over to the crucifixioners, the executioners. And Jesus is being handed off to one person or one group after another until finally he is on the cross. And John uses this exact same word of intention, of willingness, of willfulness, of determination, that in Jesus' last action, he didn't just die. He took his life and he handed it over to God. He handed it back. Isn't that awesome? This is so cool that God recorded it this way. It's not just Jesus died. And it's certainly not that Jesus was killed. Jesus, in his last act, we talk about the last will and testament of a person. In his final word, he said, "It's done." And in his final act, he said, "Here you go. Here's my life." In fact, if we go back to Luke chapter 23, this is one of those other sayings of the cross that we hear about. In Luke chapter 23, verse 46, we see Jesus calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And after he said this, he breathed his last. And I think probably his last was, "Kula." It's done. And he gave up. He committed his spirit. The word translated commit there, "into your hands I commit my spirit," means to set before, to place, to hand over. Just like here in John, to entrust. Jesus had been delivered to death, and yet he was able to deliver his life. So cool. It's so awesome. What I don't see somebody who is out of control. I don't see somebody who is just reacting to the situation around him. I see somebody who knows from the beginning to the end exactly what's going on. And for everybody who thought that they were in charge of this thing, Pilate, who thought that he was running it, the chief priests and the religious leaders who thought that they were running it, the executioners who had determined this is how we're going to do it, none of them were in charge. Jesus was in charge of this whole thing from beginning to end. Not only did he let it happen, not only did he offer himself, but in his final word, he said, "It is completed. It is finished. And so here's my life. I'm done. I don't need this right now anymore. Back to you." I love it. I love it. It is so awesome. No one took his life. This is one of the things that makes the resurrection so special. Is because Jesus laid his life and then he took his life back. If we go to John chapter 10, Jesus, several months earlier, maybe a year earlier, depending on where this is. I think this is at least several months earlier, maybe about 4 or 5 months. Jesus said in John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, "This is why the Father loves me, because I laid down my life so that I may take it back up again." Now listen to the strength of these words. "No one takes it away from me. I lay it down of my own free will." Isn't this months earlier, he had already said, no one's going to kill me. Yes, I'm going to die. And yes, I'm going to die at the hands of these other people, but it's not because anybody's going to kill me. I'm going to lay my life down again. I'm going to do it of my own free will. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it back up again. And that is what makes Easter Sunday so special. The resurrection was not a plan B. The resurrection was not God saying, "Oh man, they killed him. Now what am I supposed to do? I guess I have to bring him back to life. I'm God, I can do that." This was the plan all along. This is why I say it's Sunday that makes Friday so good. Because if all we had was Friday, we have a guy hanging on a cross and then being laid down in a cave. And the world trying to respond and to react to something that is out of their control, because it was out of their control. But it's never out of God's control. Jesus knew exactly what was happening. He knew exactly what was going on the whole time. And in fact, he had called it months before. He said, "I'm going to lay down my life, and then I will take it back up." Jesus went to the cross willingly because he knew what was coming out the other side. In fact, Jesus went to the cross more willingly than we come to him. He went to the cross willingly for everybody. And so many people say, "I don't want to have anything to do with him. I don't want to have anything to do with him. I don't want to have anything to do with Christianity. I don't want to have anything to do with religion." It could be because you've been burnt in the past by a religious person. There's something in your past that says, "I don't want to have anything to do with that again." Let me tell you, that wasn't Jesus. That wasn't Jesus. Somebody's hurt you. Somebody's burned you in the past in the name of Jesus. It wasn't Jesus. He wasn't the one who did that. What he did and what he said was, "I will lay down my life and I will take it back up again for you." You know, the word pandemic, we've been using that word a lot too. Maybe that's going to be the word of the year. I don't know. The word pandemic is a compound Greek word. It comes from 2 Greek words. Pan means all or everything, and demos means people. Same root word that we get democracy from. Demos is people. So a pandemic simply means something that affects all the people. Okay, and so if it's just in one country or just in one region, it's not really a pandemic. But as it goes around the world, now we're seeing it's affecting all the people. And these days we're seeing people clamoring for a vaccine for this COVID-19. We see people who are willing, some people who are willing to give up everything just so that they could have a vaccine, just so that they could have a cure. They're willing to pay whatever money, they're willing to give up whatever freedoms, whatever liberties, they're willing to give up everything in their lives if someone would just heal them or heal their loved one. because of this virus. The whole world is looking for a cure for something, by the way, that most of us have never seen. We're just trusting other people that we have it or that it's actually affecting people. Most of us, even with the thousands of people who have died, most people listening to me right now, not all, but most, do not know someone who has been infected with this that we know of, and we certainly don't know someone who has died. Some people do. There's no doubt, and I'm not minimizing that. Most people do not have direct contact with somebody who has died from this. And yet we believe that it's out there. We believe that it's true because we've heard other people say, but I do know somebody. According to the book of Genesis, chapter 3, there has been a pandemic that has infected the entire human race since the very beginning. The Bible calls it sin. And yet, just because we can't see it, it doesn't mean it's not true. Just because we don't think we feel the effects of it doesn't mean it's not true. Just because we don't think we see the problem doesn't mean it's not true. And we've got this thing that for the past few months has been ravaging this world, and we're ready to give up everything to find a cure. And we've been living with this thing called sin from the very beginning. From our conception, we've been living with sin, this virus, this spiritual virus that has infected every person in humanity going all the way back to the very beginning. And we don't care. We've just learned to live with it. We don't see it, we don't feel it, we don't think about it, it's not a big deal. Yes, some people have religion that tries to deal with it, but they seem to be sort of crazy sometimes, and they're extreme. They're sort of radical on this thing, right? We don't need to go that far. Why do we need to go that far for COVID-19, but we don't need to go that far for sin? Well, because COVID-19 will kill you. Yes, it can. Absolutely can. But COVID-19 will kill us only physically. Sin will kill us forever if we don't get it taken care of. And Easter Sunday, this weekend, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection is the vaccine. God has taken care of this for thousands of years. He said he was going to take care of it. He planned it from the very beginning. And he said, here's the cure. You can have life. You can have purpose. You can have meaning. You can have everything. This is why Easter is the center of Christianity, because it's the only thing that can cure us. It's the only thing that can heal us. Jesus' body was never infected by sin, but it's the only antibody that it's available if we would just apply it to our own spiritual lives. And we come to him in faith saying, God, these are your terms and conditions. God, this is the vaccine. If our government were to release a vaccine today for COVID-19, how many people would say, yeah, I don't like that one, I'm going to go figure one out on my own? Not many, almost none, right? People would be lining up, give me the vaccine, it's the only one out there. And yet we spend our lives saying, yeah, I know, God, that's what you've said, and I know that, if you even exist out there, you're a spirit, and you probably know about my spirit better than I do, but I'll figure out another way. And if I need you when I get down to the end, maybe I will talk then. It doesn't make sense. Logically, it doesn't make sense, and spiritually, it certainly doesn't make sense. The cross made the cure for sin, and the resurrection proved that it works. The cross made it, the resurrection proved it. It's the only way to be made right with God. And so as I conclude this morning, let me leave you with this last thought. And that is that if everything that I've talked about is true, I believe it is. Many of you do. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're listening right now and you don't believe this is true. But if it is, let's say for just a second, if it were true, everything that I've talked about, Jesus' death, his resurrection means that he's alive right now. And if that is actually true, that means that the same Jesus who brought himself back from the dead is alive right now, and he is able to give you life as well. Where else are you going to find a guarantee like that? Where else are you going to find a guarantee? You know, we usually celebrate someone's life and death, and then we move on. With Jesus, it's not that way. We celebrate his death and then his resurrection, his life, because it gives us life. Do you know Jesus as your Savior? Do you know, to use our terminology today, do you know Jesus as your cure for the virus, pandemic that the Bible calls sin? Have you ever come to the point where you have said to God, God, click, I accept your terms and conditions. I believe that I have this sin virus. I believe that I have violated your perfect, your holy character, that I am not perfect, that I am damaged, that I am sick inside. And we all know it when we look in the mirror. We all know it. None of us, we may pretend to be perfect to each other. We may pretend that everything's okay, but we know that something's not right if we would just be honest with ourselves. But it's not enough to be honest with ourselves. We have to be honest with God and say, God, I know I'm sick inside, and I believe that you sent Jesus to die in my place because of my sin sickness and rise again to prove that the vaccine works. And I accept your terms and conditions. I want to be made right with you through Jesus. That's all it takes. You don't have to walk down an aisle. It's a good thing because you can't come here today. You don't have to raise your hand so that a pastor can see you. It's a good thing because I can't see your hand if you're raising it right now. What you need is to have a heart conversation with God and say, God, I trust you that what you said is true about Jesus, what you said is true about me, and I accept that today. Man, I can't think of a better way to celebrate Easter Sunday than to come into a brand new relationship with God through Jesus, whom we are celebrating today. Jesus is that cure. Jesus is the vaccine for the virus that God calls sin. And I hope that you know him and have accepted him either today, in the past. If you believed in Jesus today for the very first time, please send us your contact information either on the chat or on our website, because I'd love to help you get started with this brand new journey with Jesus, with God, this new relationship. I want to get you some resources, and we can talk about that later, some free stuff. I want to give it to you because this is the most important thing in your life. So, that said, not only did Jesus say it is finished, this message is finished, it is completed, but the truth remains, and it will remain forever. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, anything that you'd like to talk about, make sure that you use the app or the website. Fill out the connection card on there. Thank you to everybody who's been checking in throughout the morning. And let's pray together, and then we will be finished.